Awesome. With that, we are thrilled to welcome in Derrik Klassen, who is one of the co-hosts of the Athletic Football Show. He's also done some work with Bleacher Report and the 33rd team in the past. Derrik, thanks for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you guys?
We are doing well. Some crazy Browns news we're going to get to after this interview, but thrilled to have you on to talk a little quarterbacks, offense, and defense with the Browns. And we're going to start with the number one question we have with Cleveland entering 2024, and that is, what version of Deshaun Watson are we going to get as we look to head into this upcoming season with Super Bowl aspirations? Derrik, I know you put out a quarterback rankings list earlier this summer, and you're not the highest on Deshaun Watson, but I also know you study the tape and chart throws like no one else does. So when you go back and you've watched Deshaun in his Cleveland Browns tenure, what have you seen from him that has kind of formulated this opinion that he's fallen out of the category of the good quarterbacks in the NFL?
Yeah, and I think the context of what he used to be is really important. You know, I think when Deshaun Watson was in Houston and playing at his best, he was a top 5 quarterback. You know, I think he was right up there, almost as good as, Josh Allen was, that caliber of player. I think what we've seen from him in Houston lately is his accuracy has not been nearly as consistent as it was. I think especially in the short to intermediate parts of the field. He still has a couple of very good downfield throws, which has always been part of his game, but the down-to-down consistency has not really been there the way that it used to. I think he is a lot more skittish in the pocket than he used to be. You know, I think in Houston he was very willing to take hits, to move around, to do these creative things, and you see maybe 1 or 2 flashes of that a game in Cleveland, but it's just not a consistent, reliable part of his game anymore. And then to me, I think the arm strength has fallen off a little bit. It just seems like every part of his game has gotten maybe 5 to 10% worse. I also do think part of the issue is, he stepped into a Kevin Stefanski world, Kevin Stefanski offense. It's very different than what he did in Houston. And they've made steps this offseason to kind of to course correct and go back to what he was doing at Houston, where it's a little bit more 3 and 4 wide sets, a little bit more gun, a little bit more empty, a little bit more RPO to kind of make him more comfortable. So we'll see how much it works this offseason. But to this point, I think they've had some struggles trying to marry what he used to be in Houston and what Stefanski has been doing in Cleveland for years now.
Derrik, when you look at the weapons that's around Deshaun, they got Amari Cooper, they went and got Jerry Jeudy, they got David Njoku. Do you think that supporting cast is good enough for him to get back to being maybe a top 5 quarterback, or do you think that he will never reach that no matter who his supporting cast is?
I think this is, to me, an above-average supporting cast. Amari Cooper, to me, is a really good number 1. I think he's almost underrated because he's playing in Cleveland. I think people have almost forgotten how good he can be. I think he's truly still one of the best one-on-one separators in the NFL. So I think having a guy like him to consistently rely on is absolutely huge for Watson. David Njoku has also quietly become one of the best receiving tight ends in the NFL. I mean, he obviously does a really good job with the ball in his hands, but he's also a fantastic blocker, which kind of unlocks some other parts of this offense. So I think those 2 alone kind of puts you in a really good category. I'm probably not as high on Elijah Moore and Jerry Jeudy as some other people. I think maybe Elijah Moore could have a bounce back, but Jerry Jeudy to me has always been a very inconsistent player, which I'm not sure how well that marries with a quarterback like Watson, who himself has been inconsistent. So it seems like it's a little bit of a shaky thing there. I will say Jerry Jeudy provides this offense some speed, especially from the slot, that I don't think they had last year. So that alone could be a pretty nice thing for them. I will say I really hope we can get more from Cedric Tillman, because this is not a receiver group that has a lot of size, a lot of strength, and he could be the one guy who gives them that. But we'll see. So I would say this is not a elite, supporting cast or anything, but I think it's a good one and should be more than enough for Watson to theoretically get back to the level he used to be playing at.
Derrik, one of the things I was told on Deshaun is that his good is as good as it ever was, but his bad is oh my God, what was that? Where did that come from? Since he's been in Cleveland the last couple of years. Do you see that? Do you see the ceiling being as high as it wasn't? Like, there are moments where you look at it, you go, there it is. That's it. That's what they traded for. That's what they thought they were getting. But then the bad is off the charts bad that just didn't appear at Clemson or at Houston.
I think that's pretty spot on. I think the other thing too is Watson used to have 10 of those plays in Houston that were at the very top of like, oh my God, this is what you pay for. This is what you spend first round picks on, in the Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, like that super top tier quarterback. You got 10 to 12 of those plays a game. you get maybe 1 or 2 in Houston. And I think that to me is the biggest difference. And when you lose so many of those superstar plays, and then, like you said, get a lot more of those, oh no, what is he doing type of plays, it's just not at all, I think, the mix that they were paying for. So I agree that his best plays still do look like a very good Pro Bowl caliber quarterback is there. It's just the consistency of it has waned in a way that is really hard to stomach, I think.
So the first few minutes, obviously, Derek, not super high on Deshaun Watson, but to prove you're not just a Cleveland hater, it is worth mentioning you had the Cleveland defense as your number 1 defense heading into the 2024 season. So, Derek, they were the number 1 defense in 2023. We talk all the time about the variance in defenses. The top team in defensive rankings and points allowed and yards allowed, etc., is not typically the same team the following season. But in your mind, why is the Cleveland defense ready to kind of buck that trend and be the best defense in football for the second year in a row?
To me, it's just, I mean, they brought the whole crew back, right? I mean, this was the best defense last year, and really the only things that they really lost were Anthony Walker and Sione Takitaki at linebacker. And I think they've mostly replaced Takitaki with a guy like Jordan Hicks. I think he's very similar body type, very similar ability to play between the tackles and kind of bang in the run game, which is hugely important when JOK, who is a much smaller player, is your other linebacker. So they've mostly brought back all the same pieces that made them the number 1 defense last year, brought back their defensive coordinator, who Schwartz's scheme is a little bit, simple, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. He lets his guys play fast, and he certainly has the cover corners to just go play as much man and single high as he does. And then he mixes in a couple of, cover 2 to kind of keep defenses on their toes. But I think this is a defense that just, if they were the number 1 defense last year, brought back almost all of the same pieces, and to me have the best defensive player in football in Myles Garrett. It was just really hard for me to pick another defense over them, even though I agree, the same defense that was number 1 last year is usually not the one going forward, but all the other defenses around them, like Baltimore, Kansas City, New England, just a few more questions that I had about them, whereas, again, Cleveland, it's the same crew as last year, so there was no reason for me not to bet on them.
Derek, we've been waiting on somebody to be opposite of Myles since Myles has been here. He's been dominant on his side, but that other DN spot has been kind of a rotating door. They decided to run it back with Za'Darius. Do you think that was the right answer? And do you think that the guys like Alex Wright,
Ogbo,
and Ogbo also can to collectively be productive opposite of Myles?
I think they can be, and I think what I really actually like about the construction of the non-Myles guys is there's a very clear understanding of what their skill sets are supposed to be. Za'Darius Smith and Alex Wright, to me, are more of those big end, we can twist them inside and really get a lot of push on a guard, so that's going to free up a blitzer, or it's going to free up one of our more nimble 3 techniques to get back over and loop and go get pressure. So I think the construction of it makes sense. And then you have the complete opposite of that in a guy like Ogbo, who is much smaller, much quicker, much faster, almost in that Bryce Huff, Josh Uche type of build. So even though they don't have another true, defensive end 2 who is just an absolute superstar opposite of Myles Garrett, I think those 3 are all good enough in their own right and kind of come together collectively to not match Myles Garrett's skill set, but kind of complement it well and complement the rest of the interior. I actually think it's a well put together unit, and just having that depth alone, there's not a lot of defenses that honestly can go 4 deep with useful pass rushers, and so just having the bodies like that alone I think is nice, even if they don't have that true second guy.
Our producer Earl's got the next question.
All right, Derek, I want to get back to the offensive side of the ball. It doesn't sound like that you're really high on the Cleveland Browns' weapons, but Amari is who Amari is. David Njoku had a Pro Bowl season last year. I think Jerome Ford had the 2nd most receiving yards of any running back that split out wide. Jerry Jeudy is coming to Cleveland off a season where he had 758 yards. And, of course, you have the new offensive coordinator here in Ken Dorsey. In your opinion, how can Ken Dorsey unlock our playmakers and get those guys to the next level?
I think they just, I kind of mentioned it earlier, they have to just lean into, I think, what Deshaun Watson was in Houston, which, again, was a little bit more gun than I think Kevin Stefanski has been used to, a little bit more empty, which the empty they actually leaned into last year. They ran about as much as Buffalo did, which was kind of shocking for, again, what Kevin Stefanski has been previously. But I think they're going to have to lean into a little bit more RPO. And I think even just beyond some of those levers like that, this is going to be structurally a more wide open offense in terms of the alignment than I think that we've seen from Stefanski maybe 2-3 years ago, where he was a little bit more under center, 12 personnel, tighter formations, really trying to run the ball. That's just not the construction of this receiving core of this team. So I think they're going to have to lean into just getting more space by alignment, and kind of letting Watson see the entire field from gun and just operate that way, and almost leaning into some of the creative playmaking that he can do outside the pocket and not being so rigid in some of the play action and drop back stuff that he wanted to do. So I think that's the best way to lean into it. They almost have to lean into the fact that Watson at this point is a little bit volatile, and just pray that he can be a little bit more, find some of those high-end plays that we were talking about earlier.
Derrik, you and Robert on the Athletic Football Show did a podcast, I think it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, about the DNA changers in free agency and in the NFL, guys who came to a new team that can kind of change what that team is truly trying to do. I know you guys didn't include coaches in that discussion, but do you think Mike Vrabel could be a little bit of a DNA changer for the Browns this season?
I actually love Mike Vrabel. I was stunned that he got fired. I know that Titans team had kind of the roster really deteriorated, but I don't necessarily know that was his fault. I've always thought that Vrabel is a good coach, and I think he's a good guy to have next to Jim Schwartz. I think both Schwartz and Vrabel are both guys that do a very, very good job of getting their guys to play hard, and just understand their technique and play in a very simple way, which again, I don't mean simple bad. They're not, taking these random chances on shooting gaps and all this other nonsense. I think they just understand where they're supposed to be. I think Vrabel absolutely brings that. And so to bring him into a defense that's still, obviously they're a very good defense, but they're not always the toughest guys. Like I said, JOK is a small linebacker. Their interior is certainly better than it was 2-3 years ago when they were the worst in the league, but it's still not the beefiest group out there. So I think bringing in a guy like Vrabel who can bring a little bit of that attitude, a little bit of that technique understanding is actually a very good thing for them.
Derrik, I'm going to set the line at 1.5. How many games does Jameis Winston start for the Cleveland Browns this season? Over on.
I'll go over.
Really?
I'll go over. Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily because Watson will get benched. It's just he's had struggles staying healthy, really, since he's been in Cleveland. And so, truthfully, I would guess at least half of the quarterbacks in the NFL are going to miss a couple of games this season, because that just seems the way that it goes now. But especially with Watson's injury history over the past 2 years or so, I would guess we get Winston out there. I'm very interested to see it, because typically the offense that Winston likes is almost the polar opposite of what Watson likes. Winston, I think, is a little bit more comfortable in the old Stefanski world. So if that becomes the case where Winston does have to play games, I'm very curious to see how that ends up unfolding.
I wonder what the Browns' record would be if Jameis was the starting quarterback this year. Like if in a world where Deshaun just didn't exist. Is that a playoff team? Derrik, is Jameis leading this Browns team, the rest of the roster unchanged? Is that a playoff team in the AFC?
3 years ago, I might have been high enough on Jameis where I would say that. But I think I'm probably not there anymore. I think he's probably gives you maybe a few more big plays than Watson, but also might somehow throw even more interceptions, even though Watson kind of struggles there as well. So I think, I don't know. I would probably lean there about within one game of where they would be with Watson, so not a huge difference.
When you look at the addition of Ken Dorsey to this offensive staff, he's now collabing with Kevin Stefanski on building an offensive game plan week in and week out. How do you see that marriage going, Derrik, when you look at what Stefanski likes to do and kind of his core principles offensively compared to what Ken Dorsey has shown as an offensive coordinator in Carolina and Buffalo and his core principles as an offensive play caller?
It's two different worlds, right? Stefanski was very under center. We want to run the ball. We want to do play action, 5 and 7 step drop. You look at what Dorsey was doing with Buffalo, and a lot of it was, okay, we're going to be in gun. We're going to be in spread formations. Our run game is going to be a lot more, they were doing a lot more being in gun and pulling guys, which Stefanski has opened up himself to be more of a pulling run game, especially when you have guys like Joel Bitonio and Wyatt Teller. You probably should. So that part I think they'll be fine with. But I mentioned earlier, Dorsey was a lot more RPOs, and I think he was a lot more quick game than Stefanski has been used to. So I think they're really trying to bridge two almost polar opposite worlds here, and I do wonder if there's going to be too much of a clash of ideas where I actually think these are two very good offensive coaches, but when you're marrying two such different worlds, I think it could be very, very hard. So I'm really curious to see what it looks like, because it's almost hard to picture because the offenses were so different.
Derrik, right now, what concerns you more about the Cleveland Browns season? The left tackle situation or Deshaun Watson?
I would say Deshaun Watson because of the left tackle situation. Because to me, one of Watson's biggest issues, especially now, but even dating back to Houston, was he will hold the ball for a very long time, and he will make some reckless decisions a little bit late in the down. And I think if the left tackle situation is going to be as unresolved as it is, that could be a huge problem for him. The interior being as good as it is kind of helps that, and I think that will be nice for giving him space. But if the left tackle spot is going to be kind of unresolved the way that it is, I think Deshaun Watson could have even more issues in the pocket than we've seen lately. So that would probably be my biggest concern. That's a little bit of a, splitting the difference on the answer, but.
Derrik, last question is going to come from our producer, Earl.
Oh, no, I didn't have one. I was thinking you could.
Oh, well, then I got one last one here, Derrik, and then we'll let you go. When you look at the AFC North, 4 teams that we have said on this show multiple times, we could see this division finishing in any order. Browns can finish first or fourth, same with Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Cincinnati. How do you see this AFC North playing out in 2024?
I would still give it to Baltimore, even though they have probably a few more questions than last year. I still think that this is probably the best team. I think they have the most blue chip, just absolute superstar level players, and they have, to me, the best quarterback, so I would put them. I think the next part is where it gets really tricky, because I think, the Bengals, you look at Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, but I think they have a million holes in the rest of the roster. So, and then you look at the Steelers, I think you can always trust them to win at least 8 and 9 games. I think Cleveland will probably win 8 or 9 games again. So this is a cop-out answer, but I really think the last 2 through 4 is a complete jumble. I trust that Baltimore will win the division. I think the rest could go just about any direction.
Awesome. That is Derrik Klassen. Make sure you check him out on the Athletic Football Show with Robert Mays, who's coming up with us next week. Derrik, thank you so much for the time today. We'll be listening, and best of luck for the rest of the season.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. You guys have a good one.
Awesome. That was Derrik Klassen. We're going to get into some of the Mike Hall allegations and stuff after a quick word from Earl, because Jason has the full police report.